Welcome to you all at this event of the Eurac Institute for Comparative Federalism. My name is Elisabeth, and I'm very happy to finally welcome Associate Professor Rebecca Nelson. She has been a winner and holds the title of the Federal Scholar Program in 2020. And it was due to the pandemic that she was not able to actually implement and to physically come to Eurac research and to stay with us. So now we are very happy to welcome her in person. And we're very happy to also welcome all online participants and the participants here in the room to this to this Federal Scholar talk of Rebecca Nelson. So she is a researcher specialized in environment and natural resources law. Not only she does, to get a bit more into details also, especially research laws that regulate the cumulative environmental effects. From a comparative perspective, she has been comparing the issues in the US, the European Union, Canada, and Australia. She also held positions in Stanford University and in the University of Sydney, doing comparative research on groundwater law. She is now at the Melbourne Law School, and she will present today on cities and the environment. Cities and the environment and their centrality at the constitutional stage, to what extent cities should be recognized constitutionally, and what this means basically also for all our current environmental challenges. Regardless of the fact that the cities obviously can act in the role of both environmental victims or villains. So she will present on the topic of cities, and she will argue that there is a point in actually recognizing cities at a constitutional level. Let me also welcome Dr. Erika Arban. We are very happy to have also Erika Arban here in presence with us. She's the editor of the book Cities in the Federal Constitutional Theory. She will act as a sort of discussant and put basically the talk Rebecca gives us into a larger, broader research agenda. Dr. Erika Arban is Senior Research Associate at the Center for Comparative Constitutional Law at the Melbourne Law School. And she's also contract professor at the University of Milan. Last but not least, let me also tell our online participants that at any stage, you're able to point out, phrase, and write down your comments and questions in the chat. I'll have my colleague Martina, who is helping me to actually collect the questions from the chat as well. And we will start now with Rebecca's talk, about 40 minutes. Then we will have Erika commenting and giving us a bit of a broader framework of what still has to be done with the research on cities in federalism. And then we will have a general discussion round at the end. So, Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Ok, grazie Elisabeth e grazie a tutti per essere venuti. È veramente un piacere essere qua a Bolzano di persona. I would like to start also in the customary way that we do at the University of Melbourne, acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which I live and work in Australia, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge that their lands have never been ceded. So this talk will be about taking an environmental perspective to answer the question, how and ought cities be recognised in constitutions? So, as Elisabeth already mentioned, this talk comes from a book chapter in a book edited by Erika Arban, and I'd like to thank her for inviting me to contribute that chapter and also for her intellectual leadership of that book. The ideas that I'll be talking about this morning, I'm also developing further in a monograph on comparative ways to regulate cumulative environmental problems. And I should also acknowledge the funding support that I have from the Australian Research Council. So just by way of background, I want to set out the broad understanding of federalism that forms the background for this chapter before I get into the meat of the question of cities and the environment. So the definition of federalism that I've put on this slide is taken from Erika's introduction to the book, being the division of authority and dispersion of powers among different groups and organisations. That encompasses both self-rule in the sense of devolution to the subunits, as well as shared rule by which those units participate in the politics of the centre. Erika points out in the book that there has been a privileging of the state in federalism, which has been called spatial statism for various reasons. Because of historical patterns of settlement, for example, in Australia, when pre-existing colonies came together in a federation and the boundaries of those colonies formed the states, or because of ethnic or linguistic or religious cleavages. And there's also a recognition that as between the states in the federation, there is a sense of territorial uniqueness that federalism helps to represent. But there hasn't been very much discussion of what the proper units of federalism are from a theoretical perspective. Some of the arguments that have been put forward say that theoretically, the size of the units in federalism should be such as to promote competition, that they shouldn't be too big, that they overpower the centre, or too small, that they don't have an appropriate voice, and that they should be big enough that they have sufficient economic resources. It's also relevant to note subsidiarity because the spatial size of the unit ought to allow implementation to occur at the lowest appropriate level of government. Cities haven't had a big part of the discussion about federalism, but some of the arguments that have been put forward are that to recognise cities in federalist systems would help to recognise their political diversity, would promote democratic self-governance, and would help in their fiscal situations, making sure that they have enough money to carry out their duties. But there hasn't been much discussion of what taking an environmental perspective might mean for the desirability of recognising cities. And that's the piece of the puzzle that I would like to talk about this morning. Unlike the federalism literature, the environmental literature is actually very preoccupied with the idea of spatial scale and has a lot to say about the fact that environmental problems ought to be governed at the scale of the problems, which often is not the same as the scale of the jurisdictions, the political jurisdictions that are involved in solving the problems. So the question that I'll be asking is, can considering contemporary environmental problems give us some insights about what the place of cities should be in federalism? And I just want to take a moment to justify taking that environmental perspective, which is a bit unorthodox. So in usual federalism discussions, there are discussions about fiscal matters, about differences between ethnicities, religions, languages. So why is an environmental perspective an important one to take? I would argue that one of the rationales for asking an environmental question is the same as the rationale that attends the question of whether cities should be recognised in federalism. So in Erika's book, many people make the point that at the time many constitutions were written, cities were not as prominent as they were today, when now around the world, most people live in cities. I would argue that at the time most constitutions were written, environmental problems were nowhere near as prominent as they are today. So in the same way that asking questions about cities helps us to modernize thinking about federalism, asking environmental questions of federalism also helps to modernize the federalism discussion. I'd also note that territorial rationales for federalism are well established. The idea that there are differences in the territory between the units in federal systems that deserve to be recognised. It's only a small step from there to think that environmental problems and environmental differences ought also to be recognised. We already, in fact, see environmental issues well recognised in constitutions around the world. So it's not very uncommon now to find environmental rights provisions in constitutions in a substantive sense, so granting people the right to a healthy environment, for example. I argue that contemporary environmental problems are so significant that singular provisions dealing with rights may not be enough. That there's in fact such gravity in our current environmental problems that it justifies taking a step back and saying, do we need to think about how the structure of governance in constitutions ought to be affected by these environmental problems? So moving from environmental rights in constitutions to asking, how does our government structure need to be affected by those same environmental problems? So in this talk, I'll be considering the implications of contemporary environmental problems in terms of the legislative competency or potentially autonomy of cities, funding issues, and also issues of coordination and the place that cities ought to have in coordination mechanisms between and across different levels of government. So in overview, I will give a little bit of the backdrop to this constitutional stage and describe what I think the key characteristics are of our contemporary environmental problems that have implications on constitutional questions involving cities. I'll discuss both ends of the spectrum of the city as actor on this constitutional stage, depicting the city as a victim and then the city as a villain. Talk about coordination in particular, which I think deserves real attention, and then just talk briefly about an ongoing research agenda and some of the questions that I'm hoping to explore here during my visit to Eurac research. The take-home message that I'd like to leave you with is that I think an environmental perspective gives us the insight that cities would benefit from constitutional recognition, but it's not quite as easy as recognising them for the purpose of giving them autonomy. Rather, it's more complicated. I think it requires thinking about minimum guarantees for environmental protection, recognising that cities can be villains as well as victims, and particularly focusing on the need for coordination mechanisms, constitutionalised coordination mechanisms, potentially, that involve cities. So what's the general nature of environmental problems? When I'm suggesting that we consider environmental perspectives, I'm not talking about an environmental perspective in general. I'm talking about a specific kind of environmental problem that I argue is the most prominent and important kind of environmental problem that the world faces. This being cumulative environmental problems. So these are not single actor problems like, say, a nuclear meltdown or an oil spill that you might see on the front page of the paper. They are problems that involve many, many contributors, say climate change or urban smog, for example, where there are many actors that contribute to the problem, and usually many actors that are regulated across many levels of government. The problems are also very complex, so scientifically complicated to understand. So it can be very expensive to identify the problem, to collect information about it, and to figure out how to respond to the problem. So as an example, at the lower left-hand corner of the slide, I've given you a picture of the Great Barrier Reef. So there are several cities that fringe the reef. Those cities eventually end up contributing pollution to the reef. But they're not the only cause of environmental damage. There's also a lot of polluted runoff from agriculture in the catchments. One of the most severe threats is climate change. And then there are invasive pests on the reef itself, as well as shipping that damages the reef to support the cities with the ports. So this is a cumulative environmental problem. There are many, many things that contribute to the environmental stress. Cities are a part of this picture, but they are not the only part of the picture. A third characteristic of cumulative environmental problems is that they're insidious and they're inconspicuous. So they increase gradually over time. And this leads to a problem called the shifting baseline problem, where we might not even recognize that the problem is increasing and becoming as serious as it is. The risk here is that the problem has waning political salience. And so other scholars have argued that in problems like this, it's useful to have more levels of government involved in addressing the problem rather than fewer, because that increases the chance that there will be someone somewhere among these levels of government who will keep the issue on the agenda for resolution. What's the place of cities in the idea of these cumulative environmental problems? Well, cities really typify this type of problem because they are dense. There are so many human actors going about their daily jobs, industries, that the environmental harms that they cause accumulate in a way that can be described by the concept of cumulative environmental problem. We also need to recognize that urban nature is valuable. So nature in cities around the world frequently is the home of endangered species in city environments, for example. And cities often have the kinds of legislative powers that are really important to dealing with environmental issues, even in the absence of being recognized by constitutions. So frequently dealing with powers to do with land use and spatial planning, water, transport, and waste, for example. So moving then to the constitutional stage, having this environmental backdrop and thinking about cumulative environmental problems in particular, we can see that cities can be environmental victims. So it has been noted by many that cities are often politically progressive, more so than their surrounding environments, and that can lead them to be more politically ambitious. So recognizing cities in a way that gives them a greater voice in politics overall recognizes that political sense to a greater degree. We can also see that cities have unique environmental vulnerabilities just because of the urban form. They're so dense that they have challenges dealing with things like waste, for example, or flooding problems, which are caused by the building of impermeable surfaces in the cities. Both of these problems can be described as cumulative environmental problems. So what does this mean then in a constitutional sense? What does it suggest that cities have these unique vulnerabilities? I think it suggests that if we recognize cities, to do so would be valuable if it provides cities for a way to improve the default levels of protection that they would otherwise be able to put into effect. In other words, that they might be able to be shielded from preemption of higher levels of government, which might choose to override the higher levels of protection that cities might seek to achieve, which they ought to achieve because they have special vulnerabilities as a result of the inherent nature of the city. I think it also suggests that in dealing with environmental problems, cities will need a lot of money. So it's costly to do things like, as is depicted on the slide, model how sea level rise might affect a coastal city, to take the kinds of steps to respond to that, like building a sea wall, for example, or even just undertaking more maintenance than usual as a result of the temperature extremes that will come from climate change. Recognizing cities in constitutions has the potential to give them greater access to funding and more stable access to funding that other levels of government will be less likely to be able to change. And it also reduces the chance that they will be forced into other ways of getting more funds, like, for example, appealing to industries by lowering their standards of environmental protection, appealing to industries to move into the cities. Finally, on the shape of city as an environmental victim, we need to also acknowledge that cities don't only cause environmental problems, they also are subject to problems that are caused from outside of their boundaries. So they experience regional and global cumulative environmental problems, like climate change, like air quality problems caused within an airshed that's larger than the city, and like activities outside the city that cause endangered or species that live in a city to become endangered. Here you see a peregrine falcon, which nests on the top of skyscrapers in Melbourne, which is endangered because of activities that happen outside the city. So then in summary, if we think of the city as victim, we can see that it has unique vulnerabilities. Dealing with its environmental problems can be costly, and those problems are spatially linked to areas outside the city. I think this supports recognising cities in constitutions, giving them legislative competency to deal with those problems, but also stable funding to do so, and recognising that in dealing with problems that are spatially linked to other areas, they need to have a voice in approaches to coordination to resolving those problems. At the other end of the spectrum, though, we can see the city as an environmental villain. So cities cause stresses within their boundaries and also outside their boundaries. You might think of a city that constructs a water supply reservoir, for example, by damming a river outside of its immediate area. Urban growth in the form of urban sprawl is a prominent kind of environmental externality as the city grows. In the case of Melbourne, for example, my hometown, as the city grows, it consumes grasslands that are the home of endangered species. So what does this mean? I think the implications for constitutionally recognising cities in this sense are that it should be avoided to give cities negative autonomy, in the sense of it being potentially unwise to shield cities from all central scrutiny. We also know that cities, the harms caused by cities aggregate with the harms caused by other jurisdictional actors, which aggregate to form cumulative environmental problems. We can think of this in the context of the urban heat island effect. So cities are hotter typically than surrounding areas because they have so much solid surface. The city causes that by virtue of its urban form, but it's exacerbated by climate change, which is caused by many, many other actors globally. Air quality is a similar example. So in order for cities to be able to contribute to solving problems that they contribute to, but to which they are not the only contributors, I think that also points to the need for coordination between cities and other key actors, including key actors at the interlocal level, so cities dealing with other cities, as well as other levels of government. Finally, the city as environmental villain. It's important to recognise, I think, that environmental harms within cities are not experienced equally across a city. So this picture here shows a protest associated with a Supreme Court of Chile case dealing with pollution in the Valparaíso area. So there were certain portions of this city where the court recognised people were unfairly exposed to disproportionate burdens of environmental harm. So in the environmental literature, this is frequently called environmental injustice. So in these situations, it can often be that the people exposed to this disproportionate harm experience a democratic deficit. They are less able to make their voices heard in a political setting. What does this mean? I think it gives support for minimum constitutionalised environmental guarantees that compel cities to ensure environmental protections across their territory. as per the Supreme Court of Chile case that I referred to, where the judges found that addressing the environmental injustice inherently required coordination between vertical levels of government as well as horizontally. So again here, there's the prominence of coordination to deal with environmental problems. So to summarize the city as villain, we have the fact that cities cause environmental externalities, they contribute to larger problems that also have other contributors, and that there can be unequal suffering within their territories, which I think cautions against negative autonomy of cities. It counsels having some degree of scrutiny by other levels of government, but it also highlights the value, again, of coordination and the need for minimum guarantees of environmental protection. So I want to move to talking and thinking specifically about coordination, because this is something that I think is very prominent when you apply an environmental lens to the role of cities in federalism. As well as the substantive ideas about legislative competency, there's this procedural component that highlights the need for coordination. So the question here is, well, why would you constitutionalize coordination? Why wouldn't you use some other lesser method, provide for coordination in policy, for example, or in legislation? Here, I think that constitutionalized coordination mechanisms are better able to resist pressures that might come when the political winds change, where policy or legislation can be more easily changed. We've experienced this in Australia with changes that have come to coordination between different levels of government as a result of the pandemic. So we used to have a Council of Australian Governments that involved an aggregate city representative. That institution has been disbanded as a result of the pandemic, and current coordination arrangements no longer recognise cities. Constitutionalised coordination mechanisms would avoid that kind of outcome. The question then is, well, say you do constitutionalise coordination and you recognise cities in some way, what does that actually look like? In the environmental literature, there's a fairly strong theme that says there is no one universal solution to what appropriate environmental coordination should look like. And scholars have particularly addressed this problem in what they sometimes call non-binary federalism. So federalism that goes beyond the nation and one level of states, for example. And I'll just list these quickly because scholars have various different names for the kinds of federalism and coordination approaches that they advocate, from modular environmental regulation, which promotes the idea of agreements between different levels of government, interstitial federalism, which talks about federalism at a level above the state but below the nation, again promoting the idea of flexibility, and collaborative subsidiarity, which suggests that subsidiarity shouldn't just be understood as devolving powers to a lower level, to a single actor lower level of government, but rather that there should be collaboration inbuilt in subsidiarity. So broadly, the environmental literature says, well, we need to be flexible. We can't have one single prescription for what coordination should look like. I think considering cumulative environmental problems suggests that we need to ensure, though, that coordination mechanisms provide for different levels of government to come to a shared understanding of the problem, that they conceptualize the problem in the same way, or at least in consistent ways, that it promotes the collection of information and information sharing between levels of government, remembering that cumulative environmental problems are particularly information dense and complex, and that it should go beyond information to avoid the problem that is frequently seen in the environmental context, where there's wonderful collaboration to collect information, but no trigger for actually taking action in response to that information. So a coordination mechanism that specifically triggers intervention where it's warranted is also important. Can we find something like this around the world? Not precisely, but there are examples that get a little close. So I've given here an example of the Constitution of Kenya, which has a particularly detailed coordination provision, which talks, for example, about exchanging information, assisting, supporting, consulting, implementing legislation, and also creating joint authorities in a way that has been suggested in the interstitial federalism context that I mentioned just before. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility to think that a constitution might include a coordination mechanism that does these things. I want to just finish by briefly talking about the next stage of research that I'm doing in this area that I'm hoping to advance here in Bolzano while I'm here. This is very early stage research looking at multi-level coordination between levels of government using law to protect against cumulative environmental problems, specifically looking at alpine landscapes in the Italian context, which are really particularly fascinating from a cumulative environmental perspective, because there are so many levels of government involved to coordinate. So with the Alpine Convention, the European Landscape Convention, national constitutional protections, national landscape laws, and then provincial laws on top of that. So these are some of the issues that I'm hoping to investigate during the time that I'm here. I'm really looking forward to discussing these issues and related issues with all of you. Thank you again for coming along to this seminar. And I'll just leave you again with my take-home message, which is that I think cities ought to be recognised in constitutions if we apply an environmental lens, that they would benefit from that recognition, but that it's more complicated than just giving them power that is free from the scrutiny of other levels of government. There's a need to also think about substantive environmental constitutional guarantees, and particularly funding and involving cities in coordination. I'll leave it there. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for this inspiring talk. I'll immediately hand over to Erika Arban, who I'm sure will link it up perfectly to the mentioned edited volume she has been putting together very nicely, and give us even more food for thought for future research agendas. Erika, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much and good morning. It is such a pleasure to be here today. This is my first time at Eurac, although I have worked with several people from Eurac before. So I'm very grateful to Elisabeth and team for the kind invitation. And thank you, Rebecca, for this wonderful presentation. So as Elisabeth said, I will just try to put her presentation, her paper into a broader context of research on cities and federalism, cities and constitutional law. So my book that came out in August 2022 was a book actually that emerged from a workshop that I organized in Melbourne in 2019. And the key message, the theme of the workshop was cities in federal theory. The key message that emerged at the time was that we needed a thicker theoretical framework in which to situate the debate on the role and place of cities in federalism in constitutional law. So the book that I tried to put together offers or tries to offer what I hope is a fresh theoretical account of cities as constitutional units of analysis. Now, when I was working on this book, when I was organizing the workshop, it seemed like cities were the emerging topic in federalism in constitutional law. Also because there was the concomitant publication in 2020 of Ran Herschel's seminal book, City-State, Constitutionalism and the Megacity, which opened new avenues of research in comparative constitutional law. So the book was broadly discussed around the world, and then book reviews and blog posts were published on this topic. And then in the aftermath of this publication, there were other volumes that came out on cities. So besides or beyond my book, there was the second volume of the European Yearbook on Constitutional Law, all devoted to cities in constitutional law, a Marseille City Summit organized in 2021 in Canada, which led to a forthcoming publication. However, I am under the impression that somehow the discussion on cities in federalism and constitutional law has not taken off as we were expecting. There is still so much work to be done and so many themes and topics that deserve to be further investigated. I think that also the pandemic that happened in 2020 monopolized all the attention also of constitutional law and federalism scholars. So maybe the pandemic can also be blamed for this. So I mentioned the Ran Herschel book, and Ran Herschel in, I think, last year, 2021, probably, he was asked what would be the themes in constitutional law, and we can extend it in federalism as well, that should be the focus of the next 10 years, so between now and 2030 or so. And he mentioned the Global South, he mentioned inequalities, he mentioned Big Brother, big data, and the New World Order. He mentioned cities, he mentioned environmental concerns. So cities and the environment, as Rebecca was pointing out, are actually important topics. And as I said, so much work still needs to be done. We can see that we can study cities qua cities, so as a standalone alone subjects, but also we can explore cities in a broader picture, also in connection with these other emerging topics. So the city and the environment, the city in the Global South, the city in inequalities, and so forth. But with regards specifically to our field, and so to federalism and constitutional law, I think there are several topics, several themes that I would like to see more discussion on. So I will just briefly mention them, and I will try to make connections as much as possible with also what Rebecca has just said. So a first point is perhaps a banal point, but I think it is important. How should we define a city for purposes of constitutional law, for purposes of federalism? Probably many people would say it is impossible to come up with a definition. We shouldn't even try to give a definition, but I think it is important to reflect on this question, especially if we want to study cities independently from local governments. Sometimes the discussion on cities merges into a discussion on local governments. The two are blended together, which is one approach that could be done, but local governments already have, at least in some constitutions, their own space. I think when we think about constitutionalizing cities, we think more about cities qua cities, not cities qua local governments. And if we do so, then we have to reflect on what is a city. Of course, probably the answer to this question would be tailor-made, depending on the context, depending on the local circumstances. But I think it is important to draw some boundaries in this sense. A second topic is that of subsidiarity. Rebecca was mentioning this. When we talk about empowering cities in constitutional law, in federalism, subsidiarity always come up. We know the story of subsidiarity. We know how this principle emerged, but subsidiarity is now used a lot to justify city empowerment, but sometimes I am under the impression that this principle is given always different values, meanings, and nuances. So if there is more debate, more discussion, more engagement with how subsidiarity would look like in a city context, this would enormously enrich the conversation. There is much room there for to study. The third point is the urban-rural divide. Now, one of the problems that emerge when we think about empowering cities, or one of the critiques that is made when we think about empowering cities in constitutions, in federal systems, is that this would victimize, in a way, the rural areas, perhaps not so much in Europe, but particularly in the global South. Empowering cities would mean victimizing the rural area. I think that both the city and the rural have their own unique features, unique priorities. And so when we think about empowering cities, we should think about empowering them in a way that also benefits and bridges the gap with the rural, and not just victimize or jeopardize the rural. Another point that I think is worth mentioning, and Rebecca was pointing that out at the beginning of her presentation, is this unit question in federalism and in constitutional law more in general. The question, as I see it, is should we redefine the idea of units in federalism and move beyond the current situation where main units are usually state-sized, or at least in older federations, so this is the case. Perhaps more ideal units that are carved out along the urban-rural axis or along different stages of urbanization could be an alternative, but also units that reflect the natural environment, that reflect the presence of natural resources. Again, there is much room there for discussion. And then another topic of future or potential research is that of city autonomy or city sovereignty. Again, Rebecca was mentioning this in regards to the environment. If we want to empower cities, if we want to entrench them in constitutions, then how would the city power look like in practice? Which powers should the cities be granted? Exclusive powers or shared powers? And in which areas, in which fields, in which contexts? Rebecca mentioned about the fiscal or financial autonomy of cities, and I think we can agree with her. Cities often lack funding and they depend heavily on higher levels of government. But what else could be done? Which models could be followed? And then briefly, two other points. Intra-metropolitan or intra-city solidarity. I think this is also something that has lots of potential, particularly when it comes to mega cities. In other words, is there room to try to bridge the gap or the inequalities that exist at city level? Are there tools, constitutional law tools, or could federalism help trying to bridging intra-city inequalities or intra-cities asymmetries? And this would also help exploring further the principle of solidarity, which especially right now during the pandemic has come up with a topical theme of discussion more in general. And finally, Rebecca talked a lot about coordination in managing environmental issues at city level, so coordination between cities and higher levels of government. And this could be included in a broader discussion on intergovernmental relations, which is a topic that in federalism is well known, but how can we incorporate the cities in this multi-level coordination? She gave us some suggestions, but again, there is room for discussion here and to test and experiment new models and new ways of conceiving relationships between different levels of government. So I stop here. I hope this helps the discussion, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Erika, for this brilliant co-talk, I would say, and for opening up so many further research avenues within the field of cities and multi-level governance in general, and the field of cities and federalism, if we want to frame it a bit more specifically. So my task is now basically to invite again the online participants to write questions into the chat. If there are, Martina will signalize it. And then I invite all the audience that is present here to please take the microphone when you pose a question, so that we can hear it and that it also will be in the archives for the recording. This is the part I still have to say. So I open the floor for comments, questions, further suggestions, sharing of own research, let's say, results or intermediate results or whatever it is, to further enrich basically this table of broad comparative, let's say, a world tour we did about constitutions, the place of cities, and all the issues that have to be still researched on. So I'll take the floor and I look into the round, and I take the list, and I'll have Francesco and Carl, and then I will turn back to you, and then we go for our next round, okay?
Okay. Thank you, Rebecca, for this excellent talk. So I've got one question and a comment, and I guess I start with the question and leave the comment for another round if there is still some time. The question is a very basic one, and it's, how do you define city? Because in the research about cities, actually there is quite an imbalance. There is a lot of research about metro cities, so thinking about the comparative research done, for example, by IACL, so the Forum of Federations publication. And but there are other cities, of course, as well. So, for example, our colleague Theresia, she does research in her PhD about intermediate cities, ICTs, and you can define them in varied ways, so going down even to a threshold, population threshold of 50,000 inhabitants. And I think there is a huge difference between, of course, such an ICT and the metropolitan city of 15 or even 20 million. And I think it really makes a difference if you perceive constitutional recognition as not something foreign in itself, because there has been, of course, constitutional recognition not of cities, but more generally of local governments in several post-World War II constitutions, so especially outside of Europe, so the Brazilian constitution, the South African constitution. But of course, experience with these constitutions has shown that actually these are only of some value if they are accompanied by something more, not just formal recognition, but funds, competencies, status in intergovernmental relations. So actually the points that you mentioned also here on the slide. So if you want to make constitutional recognition work, it has to have something added that is tangible, right? And especially if you go down to this nitty-gritty of powers and funding and so on, then it really makes a difference whether it's a metro city or an ICT, for example. So I would be interested in hearing more about how you conceive the term city. Thank you.
I promise that I only met Carl a minute ago, but I have a slide which answers his question. So the question of what a city is something that I didn't have time to discuss, but that I think is a really important one. So thank you very much for the question. Erika in her book notes that there has been quite a lot of vigorous debate about what a city should be in this context. And I will emphasize that my approach to answering this question is very much one that is informed by an environmental perspective. And there are, I'm sure, many other very valid, important answers to this question that derive from other perspectives. As you mentioned, there has to be a point to recognizing cities substantively. And I've pointed to the need to think about funding, environmental protections, and coordination. I've also pointed to the need for flexibility broadly in dealing with these issues. And I think that's part of the answer to what a city is as well, that one needs to approach that question flexibly. It's a difficult question to answer because if you wanted to define cities in a way which is environmentally informed, you would have to appreciate the dynamism that comes about from environmental problems. They're not the same from one decade to the next, yet we have constitutions in many places around the world, and my country is a key example, which are extraordinarily rigid and difficult to change. So there's a need to have inbuilt flexibility in a way that can account for environmental dynamism to the extent that identifying a city ought to be influenced by environmental problems. Some of the arguments that I made about reasons for recognizing cities that stem from environmental concerns included the idea that cities are very vulnerable. They're particularly vulnerable to environmental problems. And so to ask the question, what should a city be? If you take that argument, the answer should be influenced by, well, how vulnerable is it? Because there may be some cities that by virtue of their geographic position, say coastal cities versus inland cities, might be much more vulnerable to environmental problems, even though they have the same population, for example, but it's just their geographic position that influences their vulnerability. So if vulnerability is relevant to recognizing cities, then one ought to consider vulnerability in deciding what a city is. Equally, some of the broader constitutional arguments about the need for recognizing units based on their heterogeneity would also apply to answering the question of what's a city and how can an environmental perspective inform that. So if you have one urban agglomeration, but it's very heterogeneous in terms of the environmental problems that it faces, it may be that what everyday people would recognize as a city ought to be recognized as more than one city if you're thinking about it from a constitutional perspective that's informed by environmental problems. So this is sort of an answer which is not really an answer because I think it's difficult to provide a universal answer, but I think some of these considerations are relevant to think about in response to the question of what is a city, to be logically coherent with the rationale that I've put forward for recognizing cities constitutionally to start with.
Yeah, thanks. Well, First of all, thank you. Grazie mille, complimenti anche per l'italiano. It's a great pleasure to have you here actually after quite a long time. And as I was mentioning, it's not just because the plane was late, but it has been postponed for a while. So thanks for joining us. And thank you, Erika, also for joining the Institute also physically and for providing these very helpful comments. So it's a great pleasure. I have a few comments and possibly a question. I don't know whether the last one will be a question or not. I will see as I speak. Well, first of all, let me take some pride of the Institute and the research we are carrying out, because it looks like we are right in the middle of the focus, and we are studying these sort of things, and having your support in saying that this is actually the progressive way of looking at federalism issues supports us in what we're doing. So thank you for providing us this kind of support. The second point is that it seems to me that these new things and these new topics for research show that things get outdated very soon. And as Erika also mentioned, a couple of years ago, the idea of having, cities recognizing constitutions was, wow, this is really something that we also all have to look at. And as also Carl pointed out, the few countries that have done that don't provide a particularly glaring example of, having achieved much in terms of facing the challenges that the existence of the urban level poses, not only to the multi-level structure, but also to the environmental issues. So probably, yeah, it is not only about having a constitutional recognition that helps address the issues. The third point, and that moves a little bit into a question, and then we'll have the question at the end. Yes, cities in constitution, yeah, not a big deal so far, and probably is kind of losing its grip. The other aspect is environment in constitutions. Yes, this is, of course, very topical. Of course, the environment is now pressing, is the challenge we all have for the future. But what do constitutions say about the environment? Very little. You have pointed it out. A few rights-related provisions, such as the right to a safe environment and these sort of things. Very nice, but very difficult then to implement. We have a few provisions on the division of powers, which are even less helpful because then environment is transversal per se. So what can you achieve in saying, yes, well, a certain level of government is responsible for a certain type of environmental protection, even more in Europe, as you are seeing now in your research, where you have so many different levels that are all responsible for the same subject. So I think constitutions do not really resolve this problem. I don't know how you see that. And where I see no, to my knowledge at least, provision in constitutions related to the environment, which would be very important, is the emergency provisions. Overall, and we have seen it with the pandemic, overall the constitutions are ill-equipped to regulate emergencies, but I have no example in my mind where environmental related emergency are regulated in constitutions. And we all know that it is coming to us like, a train in our face. So, I wonder to what extent the constitutions are equipped for that. And this might be a sort of a question. And the final point is comment and question at the same time. We are discussing about the optimal level of regulation, right? And all we're discussing here is just, looking for the optimal level. And this is an ongoing discussion in federalism debates. But I don't think that we can find one way to define the optimal level of solving problems. Yes, we can have a more a stronger constitutional recognition of cities. That might certainly help, but at the same time, cities, what kind of cities, and what is the rural level doing in that respect? So aren't we moving, or don't you think that it would be more appropriate to look for different sorts of jurisdictions that are not predefined, but that depend on the matter at stake? So for environmental issues, all levels are relevant, but no single level can be responsible. So you need to identify the jurisdiction based on the issue. You know, the alpine environment is probably a jurisdiction that doesn't exist politically, institutionally, but that has something in common. If you want to do a sort of, I don't know, an infrastructure that affects a couple of territories, then the jurisdiction is the conjunction of these two territories. So the Constitution should help more in defining procedures, and we're back to EGR, rather than defining territories. So that would be my common question to you and to Erika, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco. This is kind of very tricky question because it's issue-based. And if I may, then it adds up to the more fundamental question, to what extent actually one should research more and also try to implement more, seeing also to what extent it has been, let's say, also developed by jurisprudence of concepts like solidarity, concepts like horizontal subsidiarity. All these concepts, loyalty, they sound brilliant, obviously, in constitutional federal theory, constitutional theory in general. But then if you look how they are actually lived in practice, you have a mismatch between how the institutional actors refer to them and not. They might be interpreted nicely in different rulings, but in practice, then this link between issue-based broader problems linked to dynamic policies, environment, but also migration is also very dynamic. Cities have a huge role in that. There's a mismatch with solidarity, inequalities, what you have been actually saying before, Erika. And before handing over to Rebecca and Erika for the second round, and I'll open third round afterwards, I have one online question as well from our colleague Anna. And she asked Erika to explain a bit more, what does it mean to include the city beyond the local government in the Constitution? Like a very fundamental core question. Because obviously, depending on which constitutional system we look in, it's difficult to imagine, so again, Anna, a city disconnected from the local government in general, depending how it is, if it's an older constitution, newer ones, and so on and so forth. So I'll hand over to Rebecca and to Erika for a round of responses, and then we take the last. Can you take another question? Okay.
Sorry, it's a new one. So one thing I would like to add something to the comment and question of Francesco related to the division of competencies, because we recently had a project on climate change, so on climate change in multi-level governance system. And what we discovered is that another interesting issues that is not really related to the formal division of competence, so the allocation of competence within the Constitution, is the way in which the spending power is exercised in environmental related issues. We explored it in relation to climate change, but what has emerged from our perspective in this territory is that this is a very interesting area of investigation due to the fact that the spending power is exercised not only in relation to the competence, and in this respect, I refer to both the legislative and the administrative competence, but also in relation to other competencies. So the spending power in environmental related issues or in climate change related issues, as it was our case, has emerged well beyond the competence allocation related to environment. And so what emerged is that de facto, we could say, is an area in which local government, or in this case cities, have a lot of competencies that are somehow related. And also there are many fields in which climate change or environment is not the priority, but still it comes into the discussion and into the money spent because of the fact that it is maybe a second value that is, or a second priority that comes into the decision, because it's somehow also related to more strategic competencies, more strategic choices at the upper level of government, but still it's a choice of the local, or in this case of the city. So this is something that breaks somehow the rules and has emerged with a lot of substance, a lot of examples. So maybe it's something one could reflect on. And related to this, so the financial part, I have a question for you, because you mentioned something like the desirable funding system for cities. And I wonder if your desirable funding system has been developed taking stock of existing best practices, and if you could mention something. Especially what I would be interested in is not really, because I'm familiar with cases in which equalization or redistribution or solidarity, whatever we want to talk, refer to, takes into account the different spending needs of, for example, cities, or not necessarily directly cities per se, but issues that counts like population densities that really brings cities into account. But I wonder if you have found out best practice related to, for instance, taxation, because I have no clue about that. And I wonder if you have some good examples referred to that to mention. And related to that, but a step ahead, I wonder if you have found some best practices related to, sorry, something called like green taxes. This is a different perspective in the sense that green taxes are not meant for funding cities, so for funding extraordinary needs, let's say, but still the opposite. If they function, you raise less money from green taxes because they are meant to combat pollution, environment and damages and so on and so forth. And I wonder if you have found something also in this respect, or if it was beyond your area. But I think that cities could play a role in this respect also with these green taxes, but I have no clue about that. So thank you so much. And I wanted to say before starting, sorry, thank you so much for your both of you for your very interesting presentation. That I had also other things that came to my mind, but okay, I can just stick to the two of them. The other for the next time. Sorry.
Yeah, there's still a bit of time, but there's now lots of comments and questions on the table. So I would now hand it back to the two of you.
Okay. Thank you so much to everyone for your comments so far. And Francesco, thank you so much also to the support of the Institute and the patience of the Institute in waiting while the pandemic died out, sort of, so that I could finally come. So thank you. So yes, there are a lot of comments to address there. So I guess I'll start with the point that environmental constitutionalism is now, very, very common in terms of rights provisions, but that they often don't seem to maybe result in compelling changes in environmental situations. And I just wanted to, on that point to the work of Associate Professor Lulu Weiss, who's at the law faculty, who has done work that really supports that contention, saying we see this enormous explosion in the ways in which constitutions refer to environmental rights, and it's not really clear whether that's making any substantive difference. I think it's difficult for constitutions to resolve environmental problems. I absolutely agree. I do think that there's more need for empirical research on that point. And I think research on court decisions and what judiciaries have to say and how they're interpreting environmental rights provisions is important, but also the ways in which those provisions are being implemented in a way that doesn't attract the attention of the courts is also extremely important. The ways in which, for example, levels of government might be coordinating in a way that doesn't rise to litigation to carry out those provisions would be fascinating to see more of. On the point of the emergency provisions, I also am not aware of any constitutional provision that deals with environmental emergencies in particular, but your point brought to mind the pandemic and discussions that have arisen as the pandemic has proceeded about One Health. So One Health being the idea, now the subject of an agreement between 4 UN bodies that seeks to connect health and the environment, to talk about the kinds of environmental circumstances that produce spillover of diseases from animal populations into human populations, for example, deforestation. And I'll just note that when countries have come together to negotiate, as they are doing now, a pandemic treaty, thinking at least from the Australian perspective, health competencies have been the focus of those negotiations in the emergency context. And I have witnessed a real reluctance to think about the One Health context when it comes to things like dealing with the emergencies and coordinating at the international level. So there's a reluctance, I think, to take the idea that a health emergency might be connected to an environmental emergency seriously and to coordinate accordingly, because it's very difficult. Those are not agencies of government that have talked to each other a lot, typically. And to me, that points to the value of, as you've suggested, constitutional procedures for coordinating that can flexibly not only define the geographic scope of a problem to be resolved, but also the subject matter areas that are connected and that need to be brought together in dealing with that problem. And sometimes that may be at a single level of government, but I think the more we think about cumulative environmental problems and how far-reaching they are, the more likely that is to involve multiple levels of government. So in trying to highlight coordination mechanisms in constitutions, I think that's very much aligned with the idea of having constitutional provisions that outline procedure that could be flexibly used in different contexts to deal with particular problems. I certainly agree that I think it's hard to point to a single optimal level of environmental regulation. And I don't think such a thing can even exist, because comprehensively thinking about what a cumulative environmental problem is, it's so far reaching, there are so many contributors that you will always have multiple levels of government involved in some way, even if they're not waving the banner of environmental regulation. They may well be regulating companies or a single natural resource, but it's all connected. On the spending power point, I'm aware of the work and I think it's fascinating, and thank you for the work on the climate change and spending power in this geographic context. I was reflecting in my own context in Australia, the extent to which the spending power has been used by the national government to try to get solutions between states in managing our largest river basin, the Murray-Darling Basin. And so forming those solutions on, some would argue, a somewhat fragile constitutional foundation for national action was very much smoothed by $13 billion of national money distributed to states to come together in a new arrangement to meet certain targets for the Murray-Darling Basin. So I think climate change is a great example of seeing that happen, and I've also seen that happen in the water context in my own jurisdiction. I think, though, that when the money runs out, and this has happened a little bit in the context that I'm speaking about in the Murray-Darling Basin, if there aren't firm constitutional procedures or concrete constitutional foundations for action, when the money runs out, the enthusiasm of the participants in whatever scheme it is can wane a little bit, even when the environmental problem itself is not solved. And so I think that's a good reason for thinking that there's value in supporting spending powers with more substantive provisions or again, procedural provisions for coordination to make sure that there's still something happening, even if the money is less forthcoming than it has been in the past. On the taxation point, so it really kind of goes beyond the scope of the research that I've carried out. But I think from a theoretical perspective, redistributing money between constituent units in a federation, it would make sense to consider environmental vulnerabilities and the costs of intervening in response to those vulnerabilities as part of that redistribution, and particularly in the case of climate change, and maybe most severely in the case of coastal cities and sea level rise. It just makes sense to do that, I think. I can also, though, put you in touch. Our faculty has a PhD student on dealing with environmental taxation specifically right now. So I'd be happy to put you in touch if you'd like to explore that further. Thanks.
Thank you. I will just try to answer the question that was raised online. So I guess the problem is that at the moment we have a very wide range of constitutional arrangements when it comes to cities and local governments. We have older constitutions that don't even mention local governments. The US, Canada, Australia are examples in this sense. And then we have constitutions like Italy that has 5 levels of government, although with different powers, including metropolitan cities and separate from comuni or local governments in general. We have constitutions that recognize one city in particular as being a unit, like the rest of the composing constituent states. And I'm thinking about Mexico or Argentina to a certain extent with Mexico City and Buenos Aires. So we have several different situations. The problem of distinguishing cities from local governments when local governments are already entrenched somehow in the constitution is that local governments in general do not take into account the different contexts. So within the broad umbrella term of local governments, we can include metropolitan areas of 5, 6, 10 million people and rural areas of maybe 1,000 inhabitants. So it doesn't offer that flexibility, perhaps, to deal with the local problems. Whereas if we add the city as a standalone or a separate constituent unit, separate from local governments, it allows for this flexibility. Now, of course, as Carl was saying, and as it has come up already, we don't have to create cities as separate units if there is no need to do so. Of course, it depends on the context, but there are instances in which it could be worth making this distinction, because it would create a type of unit that is built in a way that could better respond to the local needs than using something that already exists under the local government framework that perhaps is less specific and is not flexible enough to differentiate between territories. So I hope I have answered the question.
Excellent, thank you. The microphone was passed on to Federica.
So thank you very much also from my side for your brilliant presentations. I'd like to make some points on some of the findings of the project that was mentioned by Alice beforehand, so on climate change integration and the multi-level governance of Italy and Austria. And one of the points, because one of the elements we analyzed as important factors for this integration was coordination. And we intended coordination not only as vertical, so between government levels, but also as horizontal, so between policy sectors. And we found that horizontal coordination can be crucial in environmental matters because, of course, non-environmental sectors are affected by environmental problems, but also because they can affect the way the environment is managed. And in the specific instance of horizontal coordination, what emerged to be crucial are the informal mechanisms of horizontal coordination based on interpersonal relationships between policy officers. We also found that these mechanisms are not sustainable because they're not stable. So we acknowledge this kind of problem. But at the same time, I wonder whether these kind of mechanisms and the need for horizontal coordination can be achieved through constitutionalization. So this is similar to the comments were made beforehand. And then another point that emerged was the link between coordination and funding. First of all, because coordination, of course, needs funding. So, for instance, to create coordination units and coordination mechanisms that then can operate, but also because funding can be at the basis of coordination mechanisms. For instance, there are assistance programs in Austria whereby cities and municipalities can ask for assistance from a higher level of governments, and they receive funding if they're willing to achieve some level of climate change integration, energy efficiency, etc. So it's a form of maybe conditionality, which is not new, but again, it's additional to the constitutional level maybe. And the last point I would like to make is on the relevance of the constitutional level instead, because I think what emerges from these discussions is that we are talking about the relative importance of environmental protection vis-a-vis other constitutional values and principles that are protected in constitutions. So in this sense, constitution do have a role to play, but what is difficult is then to operationalize this dialogue between values and to ensure enough flexibility to allow also for change. So these were my comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Federica. Yeah, I think that the point about informal relationships being at the heart of coordination, I think this just rings true for, for people who have been in government as well. And of course, it's hard to constitutionalize something that's informal, and maybe part of its value is in its informality. But perhaps, even structures that provide for regular meetings, something that provides the framework within which those relationships can be developed, could lend itself to constitutional influence. I think, funding as the basis for coordination is also really important, and not just funding by way of money, but also, as you suggest, funding by way of things like technical support. And I think that's particularly important to think about when we think about arguments for and against local governments being given standalone powers based on their expertise and capacity. So where they may have significant local expertise, you know, they may want to share that expertise with other units at the same level, but also ask for specialized scientific expertise, for example, that may not be available at the local level, but may be available at higher levels of government. So I think thinking about funding really broadly as just support is really useful. And that the example of the Kenyan constitutional provision for coordination that I had up on my slide, I think refers to that kind of capacity building and support, as well as funding in general, that I think can be the basis for some of those informal relationships too. You ask for help, you help me, we develop a relationship, and we stay in touch. So I think there are some ways to try to provide some stability to the foundations of those informal relationships that constitutions may be able to help with, even though they can't, you know, dictate the founding of those relationships per se. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there, but I think, yeah, all of those comments were really useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think I just close by saying that, I mean, capacity, what you have been now pointing to, is obviously fundamental. And we see it also within, let's say, different other projects that partially also relate to European Union funding and involve also local government, that very often there is also a fear of actually getting the real funds. So narrowly speaking, because the capacity is not there. So it needs coordination, cooperation, and capacity support in that sense, funding broadly speaking. So let me thank again Rebecca Nelson for the inspiring talk, and Erika Arban for even bringing us onto very many new research avenues. It's always good to close a seminar with more questions than in the beginning, because that means that we have a lot of food for thought for further cooperation. And we welcome you again here, Rebecca Nelson, for your research day. Get in touch with all of us and point to the many issues you had on the slides, so that we can actually also help you in filling in this research agenda on cumulative environmental effects in the Alpine area. If there are no other urgent questions or comments, I think I'll leave it here with a round of applause again to the two speakers, and thank you very much.